So welcome to this edition of the Malta Insight Series. We're producing a series of case studies with Seed Consulting in Malta to illustrate in a practical setting some of the wealth planning ideas that advisors should be aware of. Today I'm joined by Nikki Gouda, founder and partner at Seed Consulting in Malta, Alex Jones, associate partner at EY Frankhurst in London, and Jonathan Gold, executive director at London and Capital Wealth and Asset Management in London. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
We're going to get into a case study in a minute of a high-profile entertainer, but before we kick off that discussion, it'd be great to hear from each of you how, in general, you might work with a high-profile client in the entertainment sector. So perhaps, Nikki, you could give us a flavour of what you might do in a general context from Malta.
Thank you, David. Good morning. We do quite a bit of work in this space, and what I can say is each case is different. It depends very much on the age of the client. It depends very much on family, children. But I think the two main elements which we deal with are, yes, the fiscal element, so the tax planning element from a Malta perspective and an international one. But I think what's more important is the wealth management one. We see a lot of these entertainers, similar to sports persons, for example, who gain a lot of their wealth in the early years of their lives. So we see it as a wealth management advisory and structure for them to be able to manage all their wealth as time goes by and eventually possibly as their career slows down again as well. So the structures we create are not simply to be tax efficient, but also possibly, for example, acting as trustees and getting certain advisors on board as to how to manage their wealth throughout the various years of their lives, and as their income is very volatile. So you could have a couple of years where they're earning millions, another couple of years, for example, where their income has diminished. So that's important to be able to manage their wealth then, because obviously the spending power changes from a couple of years. Children play an important part as well. So depending on whether they have any family, whether they have any children, what the relationships are, and all of that comes also into play in the whole wealth management, trust structure, and advisory that we provide.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And Alex, how do you help advise entertainment clients?
Well, we're a UK and US tax house, obviously, so we focus on those two principal jurisdictions and not others. But it means that everything in our practice is very international, which fits very well in the entertainment space in particular, because you have individuals who may be very high earning, but are certainly going to be international in nature in the main, certainly in the music business, but also to a large degree in acting and other fields. Increasingly, you might see esports, for example, which in my mind is entertainment rather than sport, given you sit in a chair while doing it. So you've got people who by nature are going to be mobile. Therefore, they're going to have international things, international complications. So the focus in terms of advising that group is navigating the quite different rules that apply to performance, to entertainment in terms of taxation. That's somewhat different to what you would normally expect in the context of an employee. And that might, whether that's touring income, whether that's royalties, whether that's or something called royalties that might not be a royalty, whatever it may be. But you have to look at them from an international context. You have to look at the interaction of multiple regimes, principally in my case, UK and US, and navigate that so you obtain the best tax effect.
Okay, many thanks. And Jonathan, from your side.
Thanks, David. So a lot of what the other two have said is plays into how we think about things. As Nikki was saying, the wealth management is very important. So there's probably four key principles that we look at for any client, and that is around cash flow. So income coming in and expenditure going out, how we think about things from a tax perspective, obviously working with the tax advisors, what risk they take, and that will, I'm sure we'll flesh some of that out, but not just the risk of the portfolio, but risks in their lives, and then currency. And so if we think about entertainers or sports people, but people who are deriving from different jurisdictions, then currency can become very important in terms of how they receive it, but also how we think about where they may want to end up spending it. And then from the entertainment side, there's probably a few characteristics that become more important for that profile of client than another private client who may just be in employment, and that is this possibly high but uncertainty of earnings. So there could be in any one year an extremely high amount of income that comes in, but that could be very difficult to forecast for the future. Depends on how they are performing and what sort of sector they're in. I think the other key characteristics are things like liquidity and portability. When one thinks about these clients, they may end up moving around the world depending on where their roles or their jobs or what their career has taken them to. And therefore you need to have a strategy that encompasses those sorts of things. So I would say that they're really the key factors that we probably think about for entertainment clients.
Terrific. Well, that's a great backdrop. We're going to bring on screen now the case of Gloria Simons, which we're going to use to discuss some of the key planning points. I'm going to introduce that case now, and then we'll bring our panelists in on the various elements. So Gloria Simons is a world famous singer, a voice that's instantly recognizable around the world. She's enjoyed huge commercial success, critical acclaim, and generated a substantial fortune from performing, and also royalty income, which delivers a stable annual income of around £500,000 a year. Gloria is 50 years old. She's a Canadian passport holder, but recently divorced with 3 adult children who are resident in the UK. She has earned a substantial amount of money over the years, but also enjoyed a very nice lifestyle, which means her expenses are quite high. Also, she has circa £10 million of investments managed outside of the UK in her personal name, and she owns a £5 million London property outright. Gloria has been UK resident for the last 10 years, but she tends to spend around 3 months of the year in the US, 6 months a year in the UK, and 3 months in Europe. She intends to wind down from large-scale tours, but will keep performing for many years to come, and is now increasingly focused as she comes into retirement about her tax position, her overheads, and management, her wealth management position. So perhaps, Alex, you could open up by explaining how Gloria's performance income is taxed for those global tour dates.
In terms of performance income, both for entertainers and indeed sportsmen, is governed under local law, but also tax treaties between most of the major countries, UK, US being a prime example. And the agreement between the countries is broadly that if a non-resident performs in your country, they are subject to tax in your country. So a Canadian individual resident in the UK performing in the United States of America will, if the performance income exceeds $20,000 of income, be taxable in the United States of America. That's quite different than an employee who might spend a few weeks for their UK employer working in the United States of America, who typically would not be subject to US federal taxes. And that gets replicated across all the major jurisdictions. So Australia will do it, Canada will do it, Germany will do it, France will do it, the UK will do it, the US will do it. You get the picture. It's where you do the work, where you perform, that counts, that generates the income. The one other thing that I'd bring in is that in the context of what we call royalties, which I think we'll talk about later, from a US perspective, royalties that relate to, for example, recording as opposed to writing may actually be construed as compensation, employment income, or more particularly self-employment income, like the performances themselves. So you always have to be a bit mindful that in different countries there might be slightly different definitions as to what income you're talking about. And again, in the same field, what I'm going to call image rights, notwithstanding in the UK we don't think of it in that context, but image rights per se will, under certainly the UK and the US, be construed as related to performance. So if somebody appears on an advert for a bottle of whiskey or perfume or whatever, they're leveraging the fame generated by their performances. And both the UK and the US will look at those and effectively say it's all part and parcel of the same thing, and therefore we're going to ascribe some of that income based on where you perform as well. So it's not just what you might classically think of as received some money because you filled a stadium, less expenses equals profit. It may well go beyond that.
That must lead to some pretty complex tax reporting, mustn't it? If you're having to then pay and file tax in a variety
in lots of jurisdictions, and it's perhaps no surprising that one of the primary venues for performance of well-known musicians in the United States of America is Vegas in Nevada, which is a state which doesn't have itself an income tax, because if you're performing in Madison Square Garden, you'll be suffering New York tax as well as federal tax. And if you are performing in somewhere in LA, you'll be paying California tax as well as federal tax. So it's not just multiple countries in locations like the US, it's multiple states that can have, if you have a pan-US tour, then it's not just a federal tax return and maybe a UK return, but also you're looking at multiple state returns reporting that income also. So yes, that's complicated. But fortunately, there's folks, obviously like ourselves, who can navigate through that.
Okay, terrific. And I mean, what might the consequences be for Gloria of spending more time? We note that she approximately spends 3 months a year in the US. What are the consequences and rules about becoming resident in the US?
She's not a citizen, she's not a green card holder, both of which would make her a US tax resident wherever on the planet that she lived. So her US residence will be governed based on the US substantial presence test, which effectively is a 3-year rolling test, which says add up all of your days, and I'll define what a day is in a second, add up all your days in the current year, and if those exceed 30, keep counting, add to that a third of the days in the previous calendar year and a sixth of the days in the preceding calendar year. And if all of those things add up to 183 days or more, you are a US tax resident for US domestic purposes. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you are a US tax resident. There are 2 potential get outs, one in relation to US domestic rules for individuals who spend less than 183 days in a calendar year, and also a tax treaty could potentially override that rule. But your start point is, if you fail that test, you are a US tax resident, and US tax residency means worldwide tax. So everything falls in, not just the US stuff. If you're not US resident, only the US stuff will apply. A day for these purposes is any day or any part of a day you spend any time at all in the United States of America. The exceptions are pretty minimal. An individual flying from London to Bolivia might hub through Miami, and so might land in Miami, wait for a few hours, do a bit of shopping in the airport, and then fly to Bolivia. And as long as that's all they do, that's fine. That's not a US day. But if they had a business meeting in the airport, or if they left the airport for a couple of hours to go see somebody or do something and then come back, that is a US day. If while they're spending a couple of days in Miami, they fall over and break an arm while trying to go to the airport to get the plane to Bolivia a few days later, then the days spent in the US, which were accidental, were not intended, where you effectively kept in the US outside of your control, those would not be US days. But that's obviously a pretty unusual, rare situation. So spending more time in the US can make US residency happen. If you wanted to think of an average rule, if you can spend no more than 120 days a year in the US over a 3-year period, you cannot be a US tax resident under that day count test, because you can never get to 183 days using that current day's third and a sixth rule if you have 120 days per year. So more time in the US always needs to be watched, always need to have an eye to it. Obviously, it might indicate that there's income being generated there as well, but it has this bigger picture of, blimey, you can be US tax resident, and possibly that means everything worldwide is taxed under US rules.
Thank you for that, very helpful. Nikki, just to bring you in, looking at, Alex touched on there, the royalty income stream. Could a Maltese structure assist her in making this holding more tax efficient while UK resident?
So ideally, Gloria would have come to us, for example, before her career became what it is today, in the sense that possibly, and I'll refer to Alex on this as well, transferring her intangible from a UK point of view, will raise some capital gains tax in the UK at this stage. So what we typically do is, both with entertainers and again, same thing with sports persons, is we try to structure their affairs before their career takes off, which is obviously not always easy because you don't know whether the career is going to take off at all or not. So in that case, holding the IP, the intangibles, their rights through a Maltese structure could bring certain benefits. So now again, as Alex mentioned earlier, typically tax is going to be paid where the performances are carried out. So the US, Canada, Australia, wherever. And usually it's done by way of withholding tax. It could be beneficial holding it through a Malta structure because Malta's effective corporate tax rates are somewhat low. So you're looking at a 5 or a 10% rate. And if you take into consideration the withholding tax, it could also result in no additional taxes being paid in Malta. So to answer your question, I would say yes. Given the fact that Gloria's intangible possibly today has a large value, getting it out of the UK might not be an easy task from a tax perspective. But had she structured that before it increased in value, I would say yes. Again, the structures we like to create are not ones where we simply hold the intangible or the rights to certain music performances or something similar, simply from a fiscal point of view. So I like to package typically a structure with both managing the IP, but also managing the client. So looking at a proper management company where the advisor on board, the agent sometimes is also part of the board, to properly manage the affairs of the entertainer in total. So both managing the intangibles or the royalties, but managing also the performances and everything. And having a proper management company in Malta with, yes, taxes being paid where the performances are being carried out, but then if any residual taxes need to be paid in Malta, those will be low, if any at all, depending on the withholding tax charged.
Thank you. Alex, perhaps there you could comment on if the royalty income was to be transferred to structures. Nikki mentioned tax consequences that are there. I mean, Nikki notes that it's obviously better to start off with these structures and build over a career, but what's your perspective on that tax efficiency?
Yes, I mean, doing things from the beginning is always best. In this case, the beginning might potentially have simply meant before becoming UK tax resident, of course, albeit in that case, you always have to be incredibly mindful that don't focus on the UK entirely, do focus on wherever you are before you come to the UK, because whatever you're about to do might carry a tax consequence there. But yes, the UK has anti-avoidance rules to do with transfer of assets abroad. We have anti-avoidance rules to do with so-called transactions in securities, so people trying to put income into corporates and then maybe converted into a capital gain by disposing of it. That's not going to work because the UK will look at a controlled entity and effectively say, actually, there's underlying dividends, we're going to give it income treatment. So there's various anti-avoidance rules out there, but very much as Nikki suggested, if you've got something that you can properly identify as a business which is not managed and controlled in the United Kingdom, is managed and controlled actively outside of the United Kingdom, then that doesn't necessarily form part of a UK resident individual's taxable income. It's also, well, I suppose two extra little things to tag on to that. A UK-based individual who owns a foreign corporate, that company is itself UK tax resident if it is either registered in the UK or subject to UK management and control. So that's day-to-day management of the entity. So somebody setting up a company in a third country, and basically they make all the decisions, if it's it was a rental property in Italy, if they're deciding who the tenant is, if they're deciding what to pay on maintenance and repairs, that can easily import that company to be a UK taxable entity. So that's why it's incredibly important to structure the management of the entity quite properly outside of the United Kingdom, and that is possible to do, albeit you always have this tension taking place. The other thing to bear in mind is that certain forms of income in the UK are taxable always on what we call the arising basis, and sometimes they're taxable on what we call the remittance basis, and that depends on the categorization of both the income or gain, but also the individual themselves. So somebody like Gloria, who's been in the UK for 10 years, so assume UK resident for 10 years, may have a non-UK domicile of origin, in this case, somewhere, a province in Canada. And to that extent, she may not have decided that she's going to stay in the UK permanently. It may be a relatively temporary period, albeit of reasonable length. And so she may retain her non-UK domicile of origin. And if so, she has the ability to elect this remittance basis of taxation. And remittance basis of taxation is normally described as saying only pay UK tax on UK income plus foreign income you remit to the UK. That's not entirely accurate. It's the bare bones. You are also subject to UK tax on certain forms of offshore income that are themselves, by their nature, taxable on the arising basis, one of which is royalty income, for example. Royalty income is taxable to a UK resident individual, whether they are claiming this remittance basis or not, even though the royalty may be a non-UK paid royalty. And there is a couple other forms of income which fall into that also. So you always have to be mindful of, it's fine saying stick things in a foreign corporate, but at some point you're going to want to get the money out. You're going to want to spend it on something. And if the money comes out of a company and you're UK tax resident, and maybe at that point in time, you can't use the remittance basis of taxation because perhaps you've been here for more than 15 of the last 20 years, or because that year it's not mathematically beneficial to pay the 30 or 60,000 pound annual charge that can be imposed if you've been here more than 7 years or more than 12 years, respectively. Maybe it's not mathematically beneficial, in which case those distributions coming out of a Malta company to pay for the lifestyle outside of the United Kingdom may themselves be subject to UK tax, then at a rate of anything up to 38.1% under current rules. And so when looking at this, you always have to look in the whole, in the round, as to, okay, is it going to defer tax, yes or no? If yes, great, that might be a real help. You can potentially then grow things within that at a lower tax rate. But is it going to come out of that entity and suffer UK tax on exit? And if so, what is the overall tax hit over the lifetime of the structure? Because if that's more than you were going to pay receiving the income directly, what was the point? If it's going to be less, then great. And where it works incredibly well is if individuals who are in the UK for a relatively temporary period, meaning not multiple decades generally, or certainly not more than 15 years, in which case they absolutely have the ability to store income outside of the United Kingdom that doesn't relate to UK activity and UK performance, and then distribute it only after they have gone, thus avoiding any additional UK taxes on such distributions. But again, word of warning, if the place you decided to move back to after leaving the UK was California, California's got a 13.3% top rate of income tax plus federal tax, and they're going to tax whatever you receive when you get there. So the point of the planning of defer it out of UK tax doesn't involve deferring it into a different place you then move to with a higher tax rate. That would be crazy. You have to find somewhere with an appropriate tax rate. And some of those locations, I think one of the questions relates to passporting and perhaps moving to other European countries. That's where that sort of thinking comes into play as well.
Okay, thank you for laying all that out. Just looking at then on the succession planning side, as you noted, Gloria likely to be able to have a non-dom status in the UK. Thinking about succession planning, she's got adult children, future grandchildren could be on the horizon. What are her options around succession planning? What are sort of the things she might be thinking about, Alex?
Well, I'm going to sort of have three themes here. The first theme is a warning, which is clearly a good deal of her career would likely have been spent in the United States of America, I would assume, particularly based on Canadian origins. And she's got she's got children. Let's just leave it at that. So the first question is, were any of them born physically in the United States of America? Because if so, they are American. And when you will have to deal with the consequences of them receiving whatever it is that you structure for other tax purposes. And let's for the moment just refer to a trust that might get created for UK purposes. So while she has this non-UK domicile of origin, that she hasn't chosen to remain here permanently, she has the ability to create an offshore trust, and typically a non-UK trust, which we're going to call an excluded property trust. An excluded property trust are trusts created while non-domiciled that contain non-UK situs property. And if so, that property can be locked permanently outside of the UK inheritance tax net. So in the years that people are approaching year 16, the year in which they will become deemed domiciled in the United Kingdom, 16 years out of 20. Sometimes you can look at longer periods than just the last 15 years to see if people will fall into this. You would create typically one of these excluded property trusts, obviously having it managed with an appropriate trustees outside the United Kingdom. You would look at it quite regularly to make sure that it doesn't contain UK situs property, which may spoil the point. And that would keep those assets outside the scope of UK inheritance tax, 40% charge above £325,000 worth of assets on death. The UK system is a bit more complicated than that because it involves gifts in the last 7 years, but broadly speaking, that will work to keep those assets outside the scope of UK estate tax, inheritance tax. But also, if you are claiming the non-domiciled status, remittance basis of income taxation, it can also mean that you don't suffer current UK taxation on the underlying income within the trust, or indeed underlying capital gains that are within the trust, so long as those don't include gains from offshore funds or income from accrued interest. So you have to be a little bit mindful of what's in them to make sure that that doesn't inadvertently get dragged into UK taxation on a current basis. But that would work very well. In terms of the greater bit of success, so that's the second piece of my three. The third piece of the three is, what's it all for? What's your intention? And trusts, in some jurisdictions might be thought of asset protection, less so typically from a UK perspective. They're more about control. They're more about saying, yes, there might be a tax benefit, but really I'm putting there because if anything happens to me, maybe my kids are too young and I don't want them to have the money yet. It's too much. They're not ready for it. Or I'm happy for them to have it, but I don't want them to do anything silly. And therefore, there will be somebody else, a respected and trusted trustee, who can assist with that distribution of monies. We don't want the child that goes off the rails and becomes an addict or a gambler to fritter away all that money. So somebody else might need to be in their place. And that's, of course, one of the dangers of fame, that there's much more pressure on children than many families. That might lead them down that kind of wrong path. So trusts don't just carry tax consequences; they're there for real wealth management purposes in the context of organising your family. If there's enough wealth, you might associate them to charitable foundations because you want the family to be philanthropically minded. You might, there are people out there who use them to make scientific grants because they want to encourage research in particular areas that they have an interest in. And so they can be used for all sorts of things, and you can involve family members in doing that, particularly adult children who may well be the right people, depending on their location, to manage some of those activities and get them used to dealing with high levels of wealth in a real practical sense before they truly become the owners of that wealth after the creator has passed.
Okay, well, thank you, Alex. Nikki, I mean, you are able to act as a trustee from Malta. The UK non-dom client base, I imagine, is one you're used to dealing with. I mean, what would you say, building on some of Alex's thoughts just there?
I think linking to what Alex mentioned, I think the main idea around having a trust more than the tax aspects is the wealth management. So whilst earlier we mentioned this management company having proper management in place in Malta, both to ensure there's the place of effective management being here, but to manage the business, we see that the trustee is important to manage the assets. And there, a lot of questions comes around the age of the client, possibly the age of the children. Do we want the children or the client themselves to all of a sudden just get into this money and maybe they are not sure, they're not responsible enough on how to spend it? So it's a lot of wealth management and ensuring that the wealth which the entertainer is accumulating is there for a number of years and possibly also for a number of generations. And I think that comes as a lot of responsibility for the trustee as well. So the way we typically structure things is that whilst we have the management company and the board of directors and the advisors of the management company managing the business, the trustee would manage the assets. Again, depending on the tax residence of the beneficiary of the trustees, a Maltese trust could be looked through for tax purposes, could be treated as a company for tax purposes. So one would then see what is most beneficial from a tax perspective. Because, for example, if a Maltese trust is looked through for tax purposes, then the income is deemed to be income of the beneficiaries. And then one needs to understand where those beneficiaries are tax resident and how they would be taxed. The beneficiaries could also be res non-dom in Malta. So in certain cases, it could also be beneficial to have it looked through for tax purposes. But I think also, as Alex mentioned, one needs to understand the reason why a trust is being created. And the way we look at it is, firstly, let's ensure that we manage and preserve the wealth which is being accumulated over the number of years, and obviously ensure that it's also done in the most tax advantageous position that Malta could allow.
Okay, thanks. I mean, perhaps Jonathan, just to bring you in here, I mean, assuming Gloria goes on, sets up the trust, those assets will need to be managed. I imagine you deal with a lot of clients managing assets through trusts. I mean, do you have anything in your process that's different about managing money on that very long-term basis, or how would you approach that, a client with personal assets and trust assets in different vehicles?
What you're thinking about there is the time horizon of the money, and you've highlighted that there. So the nature of the trust may be for the next generation or the generation thereafter, or long-term estate planning reasons, and therefore, if we're taking that view and that is there for the next generation, we may be looking at a different time horizon to the personal money. Obviously, you've then got other considerations, David, around the taxation or the arising taxation or the deferred taxation considerations. And so when you think about the asset allocation, it might be dependent on where the taxes are rising. If you're paying it into somebody's current income and they're paying a rising tax, then you may want to structure the nature of the assets differently. So I think they're two key points that we would think about. I suppose the other things that Alex has brought and Nikki has brought into this is where you're ultimately going to be spending the money, if you are spending the money. And again, that may then play into how you think about the investment portfolio, the currency that you use for that portfolio. So for example, if the trust is for the long term and the kids are going to be living in different jurisdictions, then we may want to have a reference portfolio in different currencies than the one for the client in their own personal name.
Okay, thanks. We'll come back into the wealth management consideration shortly. But Nikki, I just wanted to come back to you to ask about, if Gloria intends to spend more time in Europe, less time in the UK, what are some of the considerations that she might have around using a Maltese passport?
So in this case, Gloria is a Canadian national, so there are also certain restrictions about the number of days, the number of months she can spend in the EU. This type of considerations have also increased the priority also with UK nationals we've been seeing as a result of Brexit, because there's also a restriction on the number of days they can spend in Europe. So we've assisted typically non-EU clients to obtain to be naturalized Maltese through an investment program, whereby they would then get access to Schengen, but more importantly, to the European Union. And for such entertainers who spend or who need to spend possibly months rather than weeks in Europe, then this is something very important, because we have seen in the past also certain entertainers lose out on certain projects because of the limited time period within which they can stay in Europe. So yes, we have seen this in demand, both from non-UK nationals pre-Brexit, but also in the last couple of months, and also since the decision was taken, possibly accessing Europe through being naturalized Maltese through an investment program, which is done after around 12 or 36 months, depending on the preferences and the investments that the client would make. One also then links this to possibly becoming tax resident in Malta. So becoming a Maltese citizen does not automatically mean that one is a Maltese tax resident. That depends on the number of days, that depends on the intention of the client, but one could become a Maltese tax resident as well. And similarly to what Alex was mentioning earlier, our situation is similar to the UK's. So we do have a res non-dom type of tax residence for individuals. We do not have the deemed domicile after the 15 years. So such individuals would be taxed on a source basis, so if income or gains are arising here in Malta, and on a remittance basis. Again, as I mentioned, the two are not linked, so the Malta passport and the Malta tax residence are not linked, but they could become linked if the individual is spending a material amount of time in Malta or has decided to establish Malta as the principal residence. But yes, we've seen both the second version of our naturalization by investment program and also the first one being very successful because also of access that it gives certain clients, namely entertainers, for example, and other clients to the European market.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Nikki. I mean, are there any other quirks you'd think are useful to highlight around the tax position if becoming Maltese resident? You said the two aren't linked between the passport and the tax position, but what would you see there as something she should consider?
I mean, linking it to this case, again, there could be certain situations where, for example, if Gloria could become tax resident in Malta, again, reducing the number of days stay in the UK and ensuring she is not UK tax resident, it might be beneficial for her not to set up or not to receive income through certain Maltese structures, since those would be taxed, yes, at a low tax rate, but on a worldwide basis, whereas she would not be taxed on a worldwide basis. She would only be taxed on a remittance similar to the UK. So keeping certain income outside of Malta could also be an interesting option once she is res non-dom here. There is a minimum tax, which is low, which is a €5,000 annual tax, which Gloria would be expected to spend. But since most, if not all, of her income is arising outside Malta, with the withholding taxes being paid in the country of source, it could be an interesting option for Gloria to see whether tax residence in Malta is possible and to see how to minimize the tax liability by possibly not receiving income in Malta. What's also important, one final thing, is that capital gain, foreign capital gains or foreign capital, which is received in Malta, would not be taxable for somebody like Gloria if she were tax resident in Malta. So there's some planning as well to do around that, to particularly receive capital in Malta rather than income, again, depending on the nature of the funds and depending on how long such funds have been sitting outside of Malta.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, just to discuss some of the specific sort of wealth management considerations. I mean, you mentioned at the top, like four main things that you look at with each client across the space. And just thinking about risk particularly, I mean, how do you go about looking at some of the portfolio management considerations for that personal portfolio that is held offshore at the moment by Gloria?
I think one of the key considerations for Gloria is going to be liquidity, because if we are thinking about her future career or the earnings that she may or may not get, then access to capital or access to her investments in a short space of time may be more important. And that is something that is obviously prevalent in the entertainment space. If you have an employee who has a business or somebody who's working for a business, then that certainty of earnings or more certainty of earnings is easier to plan around. The uncertainty of earnings means that certain investments, whether you're thinking about private equity or investments that may have illiquidity attached to them, and that includes real estate, by the way, as well. So anything that you become a forced seller of or having to sell an illiquid asset, that may become more problematic. So from a portfolio standpoint, from my position, it's really about creating a pool of liquid investments predominantly that would form somebody's core investments. And the way that I would plan for this situation is to think about what the client might need in that call, have an investment strategy for the call, and then anything that forms outside of that. And by core, this is the amount that you would need to live off in the event of needing to get hold of your money for the longer term. Then everything else I'd call excess, and that excess can include your more esoteric investments, private equity investments, maybe private investments into businesses or things that you're brought because of your profile, and that's how I'd start to think about this fundamentally from the outset, David.
And we're in a very low interest rate environment. Many clients who are more risk averse find it hard. They're searching for sources of dependable income. I mean, how might you manage this challenge given that we could be in a low interest rate environment for a long time to come? What do clients do to combat that?
Well, this is one of probably the key investment challenges for clients at the moment. And actually, depending on what your currency is, then you could have even more restrictions. There's certain currencies out there that are negatively yielding just from the central bank's perspective. So that creates some challenges. You're absolutely right. I think this long-term search for income is going to be something that will lend people to find higher dividend paying stocks, for example, or maybe taking a view on the fixed income and moving down or up the risk spectrum or down the risk spectrum, depending on how you view it. So further down the waterfall. So rather than taking the AAA strategies at the top of the waterfall, you may be looking at BBB or BB. So you're in terms of investment grade to maybe on the margins of investment grade, because you're looking to find extra sources of income. I think the other point there, just tying it back to sort of illiquid assets tend not to pay necessarily as much income. They tend to retain income, or growth assets that may not pay out dividends. That may not be suitable in as many ways for Gloria's situation because of her situation. Just on the negative, the income point, I think at the latest count, there's about $15 trillion of negatively yielding bonds in the world, David. So if you think of people holding assets that they know they're going to make a loss on, that is a pretty alarming statistic, which means people who have hold of assets that are producing income will retain some demand in that space and hopefully preserve the valuations or strengthen the valuations of those assets. So if you can find assets that are producing robust income, then that should still form part of your overall asset allocation. Okay, thanks. And we touched as well on currencies. I mean, how would you suggest that Gloria looks at her allocation in respect of currency? Part of this is going to try to understand, if possible, where she aims to be, but it also will require an element of investing without looking at the currency. So that sounds a little bit confusing, but broadly speaking, if longer term she has some income needs in sterling, for example, if she's planning to stay in the UK, then you need to have a portfolio that has some stability or certainty around currency. And that will become important because she's spending predominantly in sterling, if that's where she ends up basing herself. But on the other hand, if she has a longer term view, or some of the money is held in trust for the kids, or for excess that she doesn't need, then one might take a view of saying, well, I don't need to think about the specific currency. I'm going to think about actually the investments, regardless of the boundaries of where they happen to be. And so the investment markets have a larger amount of opportunity in the States, in the US dollar-denominated currencies. Even emerging markets tend to be pegged to the dollar base. And so if we're thinking about the investment strategy, sometimes it is what's the best investment, and then we think about what the currency implications are afterwards. And there could also be opportunities to hedge away some of the currency risks. So I think from our perspective, what are the best investments, regardless of geographical boundaries, then how we think about the currency management thereafter in delivering that strategy. And I say there's various different ways that you can hedge that, and depending on the nature of how it's held, it may be, if it's held in a structure or a company, then we can take different strategies for hedging the currency as well.
Well, thank you for joining me today, gentlemen. We'll show your details on screen now. Please do reach out if you've got a circumstance in which any of these advisors can help you with. And we hope you join us next time on the Malta Insight Series.